Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. Today I want to take a look at some early automatic pistol cartridges because there's a lot of weird stuff that was available at the early, the inception of the automatic pistol, and a lot of people aren't really familiar with these things and, what are these weird cartridges and why did people use them and what's the deal with all this, strange proprietary stuff. So I figured taking a look at this, we can break this down into a couple different time periods that I think will really help clarify what was being used and why certain cartridges became popular and why some others didn't. So let's get started. The three time periods we're going to look at here are the years leading up to 1900, which are the very beginning of the automatic pistol, the years 1900 to 1904, which is when we start to see some actual maturation of the market, and then 1905 and the years afterwards, when we have a last few couple of straggling cartridges that are ultimately developed. All right, I do have a couple quick disclaimers I want to get out of the way. First off, visuals and scaling. I did an approximate job of getting the pistols and the cartridges to the appropriate scale, but this has not been done mathematically, scientifically measured down to the last pixel, so there will be some problems that I'm sure people will pick out. Secondly, we're only going to take a look at production guns. So things that are cool, but only a few were made, like the Schoenberger Laumann here, we're not going to touch. Another really cool one, the Salvatore Dormus, the other of the first two really effective, really functional semi-auto pistols. It was only military testing, very few were made, we're not going to touch that one either. Even the Maxim Silverman, really sleek gun, legitimately ahead of its time, only a handful made, we're not going to cover that one. This video is going to be about what your options were as an ordinary civilian, someone who wanted an automatic pistol in these time periods that we're looking at. So by only looking at guns that were available, I think this will give us a better idea of why certain choices were made and why certain cartridges became popular and others didn't. On that note, the last disclaimer I've got is going to be on the exact numbers with some of these cartridges, exact bullet weights and velocities. I've done my best to get the original factory loadings, but some of these cartridges are there's extremely little information about. There's going to be some debate, especially on velocities of some of these cartridges. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start by looking at the guns that were available up to the year 1900. All right, we'll be taking this chronologically, so we'll start with, in 1893, the C93 Borchardt. This was the first automatic pistol actually manufactured in substantial quantities and sold successfully on the civilian market. They made about 3,000 of these. And it used a bottlenecked and really for the time quite high power cartridge, the 763 Borchardt. This is 763 by 25 millimeter. It's the same physical dimensions as the later 763 Mauser and then 763 Tokarev cartridges, but it is loaded a bit lighter. So you'll see it has a muzzle velocity of 1,300 feet per second. That's kind of our baseline. That's where we're going to start. So let's move on to the next one. So right about the time the Borchardt came on the market, Theodore Bergman started working on his own automatic pistols, and in 1896 he would have actually 3 different versions come on the market, and we're going to look at 2 of those that were in relatively common production. The first is the Bergman No. 2, which was chambered for this incredibly tiny and pipsqueak little 5mm Bergman cartridge. You can see 35 grains at 580 feet per second, a whopping 26 foot-pounds of energy. Really the only thing that this gun had going for it was a relatively small pistol, certainly in comparison to the Borchardt. The Borchardt was basically a carbine without a stock. The No. 2 Bergman you could conceivably slip into a pocket, and that's absolutely what its commercial raison d'etre was. Now the other one of these pistols was the Bergman No. 3, which is basically the same action, they're both blowback, but in a 6.5mm cartridge that, while it's still pretty puny, it's definitely better. Now the downside to the Bergman No. 3 was it was a substantially larger pistol, larger frame, and really not kind of one of these weird neither fish nor fowl sorts of designs where it was too big to put in a pocket, but it was too wimpy to be a military service pistol. That was tried and rejected by everyone who tried it. The Bergman No. 4 was the same action in an 8mm cartridge, which we're not going to look at because only a couple hundred were made in total. But that's the Bergman No. 3 for us. So let's move on to the next one. Now here in 1896 we also have what is definitely going to be the most recognizable of the pistols from this time period, and that's the C96 Broomhandle, quote-unquote, Mauser. What this pistol really brought to the table was strength and mechanical reliability. It was by far the strongest of these guns, and it also took, while it was a bit awkward by today's standards, it took a lot of the really awkward elements of the bore chart and got rid of them. This was a pistol that you could really slip into a holster, carry with you. You could shoot it normally. You didn't have to have a shoulder stock on it to really use it. And while the cartridge was dimensionally the same as the bore chart, it was notably more powerful. Not just that it had 100 feet per second higher velocity, but that's out of a shorter barrel. So the difference is greater than you'd recognize just by looking at the muzzle velocities. Now we have one last pistol here before 1900, and that's the Chirola Anichua, which is a little Spanish pistol. Structurally kind of looks like a Broomhandle Mauser, but it's in 5mm Clement, which is an even smaller, lighter projectile than the 5mm Bergman, although it is going faster. You'll see it has a lot more muzzle energy, although 62 foot-pounds of muzzle energy isn't really anything all that significant. The problem with these is they're really they're awkward pistols, and they don't really engender a lot of confidence. So that pretty much rounds out our pistols up to 1900. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the muzzle energy of these 5 different cartridges. Obviously, we've got kind of 2 categories here. On the left, we have the blowback pistols, and on the right, we have the locked breech pistols. Now, what this does allow us to look at are the locked breech pistols are the ones that are potentially eligible to be service pistols for the military, while the blowback pistols are generally going to be much more suitable as civilian pistols. They, in theory, could be small enough to stick in a pocket. And of those 3, the best of them, or rather the least bad of them, I would say is the Bergman No. 2. What it really has going for it is that it is compact. As we saw in the chart, it has the worst muzzle energy, only 26 foot-pounds, but it's going to be easier to carry. This particular model has a folding trigger, which was an option on the No. 2. The problem with the 5mm Clement pistols, the Chirola Anichua, is they just don't engender a lot of confidence mechanically. Now, maybe that's just the examples I've seen, but they didn't sell very well. I don't think they sold as well as the Bergmans. You didn't get that much more muzzle energy. I think I would have gone with the Bergman No. 2 here, personally. Of course, the best option is just to carry a revolver instead. Now, why not the Bergman No. 3? It looks a lot better in that chart. Well, the answer is the Bergman No. 3 used a much larger frame. It's 10 inches long. That thing's like bigger than a 1911. It was not a suitable pocket pistol, but it still fired a pocket pistol cartridge. So it's really this neither fish nor fowl sort of gun. Bergman did try and get military contracts with them, which all failed badly because the cartridge was just so underpowered. So not suitable. Now, interestingly, the Bergman No. 3 is probably the best-selling of these 3 unlocked pistols, because a lot of people did buy them, I suspect, as technological novelties and as recreational pistols. They were good target guns because they were big enough to get a good grip on, but they had a nice light cartridge that was pleasant to shoot. Now, when we go ahead and take a look at the potential service pistols, the easy winner, now there are only 2 options, but the easy one to choose is the Broomhandle Mauser. It has a more powerful cartridge, which is nice, but probably more importantly, it's not nearly as awkward to handle and use as the bore chart. The bore chart was really in its element when you put a shoulder stock on it and treated it like a short-barreled carbine. If you're looking for a handgun, the C96 Mauser is the easy choice. While it's considered awkward and kind of goofy by today's standards, it hands down beats the bore chart. So, with that in mind, this tells us, as of 1900, with pistols that were actually commercially available, the C96 Mauser was going to be by far the best choice people could have for an actual powerful military-style pistol. And that's reflected in the actual market results. The C96 became a very popular pistol and sold very well. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what's going to be coming up in the next couple of years, 1900 to 1904. The first thing we have up is the Browning model of 1900. Now, technically, this was actually introduced in 1899, but I think it really fits better into this second period here, and that's when it really became commercially available. Now, what's interesting about the 1900 is that it was built around this brand new cartridge, the 32 ACP automatic Colt pistol in the US, called 7.65mm Browning in Europe. And it's not that great of a cartridge, really. Ballistically, it's not bad, but it's actually a semi-rimmed cartridge, meaning that it actually headspaces on a small extended rim at the base, rather than being fully rimless like pretty much all modern cartridges are. Now, what really sold the 1900 wasn't so much the cartridge as it was the pistol. This was the very first pistol to actually have the concept of a slide. It was invented by John Browning, manufactured and marketed by FN out of Belgium, and in fact, the Belgian army actually adopted this in 1900, very early. It was adopted by a number of other countries as well, and it became a fantastically popular pistol on the civilian market, as well as a potential armament for military officers who had to purchase and provide their own handguns. So the 32 ACP would go on to be used in a wide variety of other pistols, largely based on the popularity of the Browning model of 1900. Now, at the same time, also in 1900, we have another Browning pistol, this time being marketed in the US by Colt, and that's also maybe confusingly called the model of 1900, but in this case it's a pistol based on the 38 automatic cartridge. This would go on later to be powered up a bit, same outside dimensions but higher pressure, and called the 38 Super. For our purposes here, this is actually the 38 ACP or 38 automatic. It would be used in a couple of Colt pistols, the 1900, the 1902, also the 1903 pocket hammer. And it never really became all that successful, which is kind of interesting because on paper it's actually a pretty decent round for the period. Really, I think what happened here is Colt ended up trying to follow the American military market, not necessarily a bad plan, certainly not in retrospect, and their development ended up going much more into the 45 automatic cartridge, which would come a few years later. For that reason, you could buy 38 ACP pistols for a while. This was also the cartridge that would be used in the Webley Fosbury semi-auto sort of revolver. They had 45 caliber ones as well as an 8-shot version in 38 ACP. So an interesting piece there that has definitely fallen out of favor in modern times. Now in 1900 we have another very influential pistol come on the market, and that is the Luger. Hugo Borchardt had been unwilling to modernize his C93 Borchardt pistol, so the manufacturer, DWM, brought in a guy named Georg Luger to do the job for him, and Luger put together what would become one of the most iconic pistols in history. Now, when this was first introduced in 1900, it was chambered for the 7.65mm Parabellum cartridge, which is a new cartridge developed for this gun, and it was a remarkably powerful cartridge for the time. Still, relatively speaking, a little bit hampered by having a lightweight bullet because it was a small bore diameter, but this would be tested by virtually every major military on the planet and adopted by a bunch of them. First off, it was adopted by the Swiss in 1900, making them one of the very first countries to actually adopt a self-loading automatic pistol. And in this case, a self-loading, locked breech, true service pistol. It would go on to be adopted by the German military, but not in this caliber. So we're going to leave that for a future pistol here, which we'll get to in a few moments. Because before we get to that, we do also have Ferdinand Mon Liquor to take a look at. Now, Mon Liquor had tried for a while to develop his own semi-auto pistol, and he had a bunch of not quite successes until finally, in 1901, he came up with a pistol that would actually become successful on the commercial and, to a lesser extent, the military market. This is the, obviously, model of 1901 Mon Liquor. It's a delayed blowback pistol, and it uses, again, a brand new proprietary cartridge. You're seeing that most of the guns around this time are using, the gun comes with its own specific cartridge, and that's because there aren't really a whole lot of cartridges that have taken off and become popular. Certainly for a gun like this, which is delayed blowback, you couldn't chamber it for the 7.63 Mauser cartridge because that would be a little too powerful. You'll notice here that the velocity on the Mon Liquor cartridge is rather slower, about like 30% slower than the Mauser cartridge, and that's simply because of the mechanical limitations of the operating system of this pistol. However, it was a relatively small, relatively compact pistol, small in the hand, very comfortable to shoot, and it would be adopted actually by the Argentine military in 1905, as well as being a legitimate commercial success for Mon Liquor. So that's another cartridge that we'll have to keep an eye on because it was out there and being used. Now the next one I have up here is the model of 1901 Frommer pistol, which was, I should say, the Frommer itself was not a widespread pistol. It failed military trials, was not produced commercially in any substantial numbers. However, I've included it because it did use the 8mm Steyr cartridge, and we will see this cartridge come up in just a couple years later in the Rothsteyr model of 1907 pistol, which was adopted by the Austro-Hungarian military in, of course, 1907. So this is the cartridge. Well, the Frommer pistol was kind of a footnote that went nowhere. The cartridge actually did stick around. In fact, 8mm Steyr is still being manufactured new today by Fiocchi, so it survived that long. That alone makes it worthy of note. 8mm Steyr is actually relatively similar to that 7.63 Mon Liquor. It's a little bit bigger bullet, a little bigger bore diameter, so a little heavier, but right about at the same velocity. And it would be used by a number of locked breech pistols. So now, also in 1901, yet another 1901 development, we've got an entry going back into the sort of compact civilian carry pistol market, and that's the Bergman Simplex. Now, you remember Bergman from our earlier segment. Theodore Bergman has been working on a whole bunch of pistols. He has a continuous development process. We've skipped a couple here that were experimental or didn't sell or were rejected by militaries. The Simplex is an interesting one in that it's kind of a dead end of its own development, and it's a very compact blowback pistol designed specifically for the civilian concealed carry market. And you can see it. We have an 18mm long case, pretty small. A lot of people will say the case is kind of a knockoff of the 32 ACP. The 7.65 Browning. You can see it's got the same bullet weight. It's a little bit slower. And between the cartridge being a little bit slower and the pistol being more complex, it was not a successful competitor to Browning's Model 1900 and later Model 1903 pistols, which would become phenomenally popular. The Bergman was just a bit too funky, weird, and probably not as reliable as the Browning guns. However, it was, multiple thousands of them were made and sold, and so it's worthy of a spot here with its own proprietary 8mm Bergman Simplex cartridge, not to be confused with a longer 8x22mm cartridge for a locked breech Bergman. Anyway, 1902 is when we finally see the 9mm Parabellum, aka 9mm Luger cartridge, appear on the market. The German military had wanted a bit larger cartridge. In fact, a number of countries did. The US was also interested in a larger cartridge than the 7.65 Parabellum. So DWM obliged. They basically took the 7.65 Parabellum, necked it up to 9mm, stuck it right back in the same Luger frame. No changes to the frame. It's the same overall length. And offered that up for military trials. And this one would really take off. This is the pistol that the German military would adopt, the Navy first in 1904, and then the German Army in 1908, making it the P08 Luger, which is what most people recognize the gun as today. You'll see they didn't sacrifice any of the ballistic power of the cartridge in this necking up process. It's got a heavier bullet, still traveling quite fast, and of course this is the 9mm Parabellum that we still have today. Now, in 1903, the Bergman Mars would come out. We saw the Bergman Simplex a minute ago. That was the blowback, concealed, civilian type offering that would come after the turn of the century from Bergman. This was his continuation, or rather his engineer, Louis Schmeisser's continuation of work on locked breech pistols. The Bergman Mars was actually finally a fairly modern gun in this realm from Bergman. He had an 1897 version that was really awkward and funky looking, simplified it down to the Bergman Mars, developed a new cartridge for it, the 9mm Bergman, which is a pretty legitimate cartridge, 135 grains at 10,050 feet per second. Ballistically, it's not quite as good as the 9 Parabellum, but not really anything to sneer at. And this would definitely attract some military attention. The Spanish military adopted it in 1905, although it took them a couple years to actually get production pistols into their hands. But this would go on to have a reasonably long service. The Danes would adopt a slightly updated version in 1910, and it would be a successfully commercially marketed pistol as well. Next up, the 9x20 Browning cartridge. This is one that a lot of people aren't that familiar with today, but it did see a fair amount of use. Something like 6 or 7 different countries adopted this pistol. It was the pistol that went along with it, I should say, was the FN model of 1903. And this is kind of an updated and scaled up version of the Browning 1900. Also, it's an upscaled version of the 1903 Browning that was made in the US, the Colt pocket hammerless. But this was a version made for military service. So that 9x20 Browning long cartridge, it is a semi-rimmed cartridge. And again, like the 9mm Bergman, it's not really that bad of a cartridge. Slightly less powerful than the 9mm Luger, but in this case, that was done because this was a blowback pistol. It has a nice heavy slide, nice heavy spring, which allows it to function reliably and safely with this cartridge. And it was quite popular. The Belgians adopted it, among with many others. The most popular, the most numerous military version of this was the Swedish one. They adopted it in 1907, and you can find a lot of those still on the market today. They have typically been rechambered for .380 because that 9mm Browning long really fell out of popularity. Part of the reason for that is probably that this was another semi-rimmed cartridge, which makes it just a little more difficult to work with in pistol design than a true rimless round. So that did not have that going for it. Now, we need to throw in the Grandpa Nambu here because it does fit in our timeline. This was the first pistol design indigenous to Japan, designed by Kijiro Nambu. And again, he developed his own cartridge to go along with it, which was the 8mm Nambu cartridge, a little bottlenecked round. And even by the standards of this time period, this was a rather underpowered cartridge. 102 grains, 950 feet per second, just not that impressive for a locked breech pistol. What he should have done probably was either make the pistol cartridge a little more potent or simplify the gun. This was a locked breech gun, and for this cartridge, it really didn't need to be. You could get a more powerful cartridge in the 9x20 Browning and still have a blowback pistol. But this cartridge would go on to serve the Japanese military all the way through the end of World War II. So it's an important note in history, and I wanted to add it in here. Last but not least, we have the 455 Webley self-loading. This was not a particularly successful cartridge. It was first introduced in 1904 with this absolutely massive Webley pistol, which did not successfully pass military testing. Webley would go on to continue to iterate on the pistol, and eventually it would be adopted in 1913 by the British Navy, but never manufactured in particularly large numbers. This was basically a rimless version of the 455 Webley revolver cartridge. The big rim on that revolver cartridge was a major handicap in getting the pistol, the cartridge, to work in semi-auto pistols. So they developed a rimless self-loading version of it. Not a whole lot we need to say about this one because it really is right on the border between a successful gun and an experimental only gun. So that pretty much covers all of our pistols up to 1904, or at least our new cartridges that were successful. So let's go ahead and take a look at them in context with each other. So once again, we can split this chart into two pieces with the compact, commercial, civilian, blowback style pistols at the far left end of the spectrum, and then everything else being service pistols. We only have two of the blowback, well, there are more than two blowback, but only two of the compact civilian carry style of guns here, the 8mm Simplex and the 32 ACP. You can see the 32 is actually the more ballistically potent of the two cartridges, not by a huge margin, but substantial. And now, if we take a look at the other end of the spectrum, we'll see that we have a whole bunch of service pistols, but if you leave out a couple at the bottom, namely the 455 Webley and the Nambu and the Mon Liquor, everything else is pretty darn similar. Now, yes, the 9mm Parabellum is at the top of the heap, but not by a whole lot. Just a couple of percentage points. I do also want to point out that this is muzzle energy, which is not necessarily the only thing to be considered. For example, you can see the 455 Webley is kind of down there at the bottom. However, it does have by far the heaviest bullet of the group, and muzzle energy, it's mass times velocity squared, really does put an emphasis on velocity over bullet mass, which is not necessarily, strictly speaking, what you would want to be concerned with. The US and the British governments both put a much higher importance on bullet weight and bullet diameter, and that was reflected in what they would ultimately adopt. So take the chart with a grain of salt. So the clear winner for pocket pistols is the Browning 1900. Really no contest there. And this really has as much to do with the gun as it does with the cartridge. That 32 ACP cartridge, semi-rimmed, is a little bit anachronistic today. It's not the best cartridge Browning could have made for this gun. But the gun itself was such an excellent design for the time period that it completely overwhelmed any actual problems with the cartridge. And that cartridge would go on to be phenomenally popular even to this day, largely because of the success of the 1900 pistol. Now, if we turn to the military sidearm side of things, once again we have a pretty obvious winner from this time period, and that is the Luger. Luger in 9mm Parabellum was the best. Luger in 7.65 is pretty close runner-up. Obviously, the gun itself was successful. They were a bit expensive, but they were ergonomic. They were very comfortable to shoot. They were accurate. They were reliable. They were really excellent pistols for the time. There weren't a whole lot of, well, there weren't any competitors that could quite match the Luger. So congratulations to DWM. Congratulations to Georg Luger for designing the piece. Did a fantastic job. And it's really no surprise that this would turn out to be the most popular pistol from this era. Now, we do have some nice runners up here. The Bergman Mars was a strong contender. The FN 1903 was a strong contender. The Colt 1900 was a strong contender. None of them quite matched the Luger, although the Browning designs would kind of make their own comeback in a few years' time. It would just take them a little while to catch up. So keep in mind, all of these, well, not the Colt, the FN here and the Bergman Mars were adopted by major military powers. The Colt, of course, would be, but not in this current guise. Now, on that subject, we do have a couple of stragglers. There are a few cartridges that are relevant to this discussion that didn't show up by 1904. These are cartridges that came into being really between 1905 and 1910. So I just want to touch on a couple here. Let's go ahead and start with the 45 ACP. This is what Colt would put its work on that 1900 pistol into eventually. The US military was not satisfied with a 38 caliber pistol. They wanted 45 caliber. And Colt would, of course, scale up the pistol, the Browning tilting barrel designed to meet the 45 ACP cartridge, which, by the way, Browning also designed, put together that cartridge as well. This would become obviously a standard cartridge, still used extensively today. It would be adopted by the US in 1911, of course. First pistol using it was in 1905. So still a pretty darn early cartridge. The Colt 1905 itself would be a reasonably successful pistol on the commercial market, but was not adopted by any military. Nobody, military-wise, would adopt this cartridge and gun until it reached the 1911 stage of development, which is really a much more refined version than the 1905 here. This one has no manual safety of any kind, the grip's not quite as comfortable, and the operating mechanism isn't quite as durable. So, another one that we're going to take a look at, again from Browning, is the 25 ACP. This was introduced in 1906 with the so-called Baby Browning. What's interesting about this is the 25 ACP is a pretty pathetic cartridge. Doesn't really offer any improvement over some of the small caliber cartridges that were available way back before 1900. However, what it does have going for it is that it was introduced with a Browning style pistol, basically a scaled down Browning 1900 or 1903 pocket hammerless. And the Browning name itself would convince people to buy this pistol even if the cartridge was kind of unimpressive and underwhelming. Now, obviously, the Baby Browning was a very compact pistol, so it was an excellent piece for the civilian, small, concealable market. But really, the cartridge itself owes its existence to the pistol and not the other way around. And lastly, while we're talking about more Browning cartridges, the 380 automatic was also introduced in this time period, 1908 specifically. It was introduced in the 1908 pocket hammerless. This is the same pistol that Colt had introduced in 1903 in 32 caliber. They scaled it up to 380. The 380 cartridge here really is quite good. Unlike most of Browning's other cartridges, with the exception of the 45, it is a rimless pistol cartridge. It was a nice modern design. As you can see from the numbers, it's a pretty effective, ballistically effective cartridge for its size, and for these reasons and more, it remains popular today. what we've done here, I think, really only scratches the surface of the development that was going on during this time period. It was really a robust period of invention and development. And what we looked at today are really just the highlights, the things that really did become popular globally and on a large scale. If you're interested in these sorts of cartridges and these pistols, there is just so much more to research and look into and learn about these. But I hope you enjoyed this overview. Hopefully getting some context on what was developed when was interesting and educational. I do want to thank James D. Julia Auctioneers for being my source for most of, well, all of these pistol pictures, and a fantastic reference database at munition.org of cartridge pictures and information. Definitely check that out if you want that info. If you enjoy this, please consider checking out my page on Patreon. That's all I'll say about that for today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.